So Joe Rogan made some comments on his podcast about the general election and about Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. Let's take a listen.
Choice at all. How
Yeah.
so?
I want a choice of an actual president that's viable. I don't have one. So then you're
Right.
going to ask me, well, which of the non-viable people do you like best?
Well, this is the real issue with the Democratic Party. They've essentially made us all morons.
Yeah.
With this Joe Biden thing, they really have. They
Can you
made us all
imagine?
morons.
Who do we need? I mean,
I
none
can't
of-
vote for that guy.
I can't vote for him.
I can't vote for him.
I can't vote for Trump.
I'd rather vote for Trump than him. I don't think he could handle anything. I mean, you're relying entirely on his cabinet. Like, if you want to talk about an individual leader that can communicate, he can't do that. And we don't even know what the fuck he's going to be like after a year in office. The pressure of being the president of the United States
Right.
is something that no one has ever prepared for.
Right.
The only one who seems to be fine with it is Trump, oddly enough.
So it's very interesting, the fallout from this, because if you remember a few months back when Joe Rogan said he was probably going to vote for Bernie Sanders in the election, in the California primary that was coming up on Super Tuesday. And the Bernie Sanders campaign ran an ad promoting that clip of Joe Rogan saying that. And the media frenzy was insane. So many people on Twitter tweeting about it, saying honestly absurd things about Joe Rogan, calling him racist, homophobic, transphobic, and that the Bernie Sanders campaign was gross for touting this endorsement and that they should disavow Joe Rogan as soon as possible. So now these same people are back to say that they were right about Joe Rogan, because now Joe Rogan is saying that he would probably rather vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden, even though I don't think he'll vote for Donald Trump in the end. He voted for Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party in 2016. I imagine he'll do something similar this year. But the fact that they think that because he's now saying that he would vote for Donald Trump, right, he would rather vote for Donald Trump than vote for Joe Biden, that this is somehow an indictment of Bernie Sanders, when in reality this is an indictment of Joe Biden. Think about the rhetoric that we've heard throughout this entire election cycle. It's all been about electability. That the key to winning this election is that you need to reach out and you need to win over swing voters, voters who would vote for Donald Trump. It's important. Voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, we need to bring them back into the Democratic Party. Now we have a specific example of someone who would now vote for Trump, who was brought into the Democratic Party only because of Bernie Sanders, but now is not going to vote for the Democratic ticket in November because the leader is Joe Biden, and somehow this is an indictment on Bernie Sanders. I think it shows that the electability argument was never in favor of Joe Biden. It was always in favor of Bernie Sanders because he has this unique outreach to independent voters like this who are relatively apolitical. But the media used electability simply to prop up the candidate which they wanted. I think the only reason that electability was as important as it was, and that it was highly viewed in favor of Joe Biden, was because the media willed it to be. If you look at the polls right before Super Tuesday, right after Bernie Sanders had won Nevada, with all the candidates in the race, Bernie Sanders was at the top consistently in the electability argument, and Joe Biden had plummeted after he was getting throttled in Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada. But then, as soon as he won South Carolina and all the other candidates dropped out, somehow the electability argument skyrocketed for Joe Biden in the polls. And I wonder why. I mean, maybe it's because the mainstream media went wall-to-wall, non-stop positive coverage for him, saying he was the most electable candidate for 72 hours straight. But not only did they do that for those 3 days, they had been doing that for a year, planting the idea that in order to win, you need to vote for someone who is further right, closer to the Republican Party, because that's how you pull those Trump voters over. Now we see a clear example of someone who has the largest podcast in the entire world certainly there are a lot of people listening to his podcast who think in a similar fashion as he does, who were going to vote for Joe Biden, or we're going to vote for Bernie Sanders, but are now skeptical of Joe Biden and might even vote for Trump, and somehow that's an issue with Bernie Sanders. Do you notice how the Democratic establishment and the mainstream media always blame the voters when it's not what they like, but when their voters refuse to vote for Bernie Sanders, like someone like Mike Bloomberg and their supporters may have implied, it's not the voters' fault. It's the candidate's fault for not reaching out to the voters properly. Like when black voters don't vote for Bernie Sanders, it's Sanders' fault for not reaching out to them. But when those young voters don't vote for Joe Biden, it's not Joe Biden's fault for not reaching out to them. It's the voters' fault for being young and naive and dumb and whatever for not supporting the candidate. So they refuse to take any responsibility for their own actions. I think it's clear. The candidate has to meet the voters where they are. So it's on Bernie Sanders. It's his fault for not reaching out to African American voters in the South. But it's also on Vice President Biden for not reaching out to young voters and those independent voters who are now unlikely to vote for him. And so I just think that anyone who sees this story and comes out with the conclusion that that Joe Rogan is the problem is either a complete political hack or has no idea what they're talking about. I mean, transphobic because he doesn't believe that people who went through puberty as men and are not disclosing that shouldn't be able to compete in competitive fighting against women. That makes someone a transphobe, homophobic, and racist. Has anyone ever listened to the Joe Rogan podcast? I don't know Joe Rogan. Has anyone ever listened to his podcast? Anyone who has listened to his podcast would not use those accusations against him. It's absurd. And to think that a Joe Rogan endorsement is worse than a Mike Bloomberg endorsement, someone who perpetuated stop and frisk and actually ruined like millions of lives in New York City, it's insane. And I think this is exactly what's wrong with the Democratic Party. They use political correctness in order to police the rhetoric and not allow any conversation outside of what they want and to avoid talking about any actual issues. And they scold the voters whenever they don't fall in line with whatever they want. So I just think it's something you got to look out for. And remember that Joe Rogan in the situation is not the problem at all. It's Joe Biden.